You don't have to be great. You just have to be not bad. In other words, common sense rules. John also tried to teach us not to take everything so seriously. From the beginning at Wang, he tried to keep everything loose. His motivational techniques were certainly offbeat, but very effective. From shooting people with water pistols and the ceremonial tie cutting, which really meant you were officially welcome to the team, to the infamous balloon fight at the Sheraton Boxborough with our counterparts from DEC. In all of this, retaliation was allowed and expected. And as you know, some of the pranks were classics. Jolly Torrielli, you're here somewhere, I know, and the moose head in the bed with him and so forth. So, John taught us never to take away a person's dignity by putting them in over their head. This led us to tough soul-searching and difficult decisions, which ultimately were correct for both the organization and the individuals involved. He had ultimate trust in the people he was close to. Although he left Wang over 6 years ago, I, like others in the room, still have a key to the house in Waterville. Although I gave up going because the instructions about lights, heats, hot water became too difficult to follow. And if you want the key back, Nancy, you can have it. One of John's greatest gifts to us was the fact that the values and lessons he passed on to us are invaluable not only in the workplace, but also in our everyday lives. In closing, I would like to say that it was probably unfair for John to go at such an early age. But this brings to mind another of John's classic quotes, which he always used when you strayed away from an issue. Nobody said it was going to be fair. And after all, he took the proverbial to go with your boots on one step further. He had his skis attached to them, and that was the way I think that he wanted to go. We will miss his advice and counsel, but we will never forget what he has done for all of us. To Nancy, Steve, Jean, Thelma, although your immediate family is small, your extended family, us, is large and widespread. And should you need us, we will always be there. Thanks. Before we have Pat, Jean's going to come up and explain one housekeeping rule.
Hi, I'm Jean Kropper, for those of you I haven't seen for a long time or haven't met. Thanks for coming. It's nice for us, as probably as well as for you. There are 4 handbound books that I've made in the last few days, and they're circulating around. They have a lot of photographs in. You might find yourself in one of them. Write in them, tell us about the monkeys and the water pistols and something you learned and something silly, irreverent, whatever. Those are for us to keep, and we'd really appreciate your contributions. I'm in Sydney, Australia, and I'm in the phone book, so if any of you are down there in business, I'd love to see you. It's nice to have people to talk to about my dad, and it'd be nice if you stopped in. I guess that's it. Thank you.
If John was here, he'd say, "Hey, Sweeney, stand up." So I am standing. I've been told not to touch this. Is that okay? Can everyone hear me? I won't ask if people can understand me, but I'll try. I first had the pleasure and the privilege of meeting John almost 20 years ago now, believe it or not, in a squash court in Galway, Ireland. And a lot of people don't remember where they meet someone first. A lot of us remember where certain significant events happened. Like, I think we all know where we were when we heard that President Kennedy had been shot. But I remember precisely to this day where I was and what he said. He made a remarkable impression on me. I've tried over the last 2 weeks to figure out one word that would describe John. And Harvey Cohen helped me, and I think he picked the word correctly in picking the word. He was challenging, very challenging. Whether it was during the tense periods at work, or whether it was on the racquetball court, or whether it was racing through the towns and villages of Scotland and Ireland on point-to-point races, doing some crazy things like that some of us and some people I see in the audience were participated in. Or, of course, skiing down his beloved Waterville, which we all raced many, many times with him. And it was appropriate that that's what was the last thing he did. There are thousands of us around the world whose lives have changed dramatically because of being touched by John. I see a lot of them here today, from Scotland, from Ireland, from Taiwan. You know, he made a major impact in Ireland, Scotland, Puerto Rico, Taiwan, Mexico, Australia, and of course the USA. He was a driven man. All of us who worked and played with him, and I seem to think we played with him more often than we worked with him, but he had a real fun side to him. And I know when the alumni of Polaroid, Digital, Wang, and Hatco, and there are thousands of us, when we meet in little groups from time to time, we will have a lot of laughs reminiscing about the fun times we had with John. John was always prepared, as those of you who know him will attest to, and there are legions of stories about how well he was prepared. I had one. Once he came to Ireland to visit us, and he decided to take us on an off-site meeting to, above all places, the Aran Islands. So we took off to the Aran Islands, and halfway through, or coming close to the evening, the lights went out on the Aran Islands, and I guess I felt with some of my friends it was time to have a glass of wine or a pint of Guinness. But it wasn't that time of day yet for John. He reaches into his little bag, he pulls out 2 flash lamps, he nails them to the ceiling, and we continue to work until it was wine time. Another thing he often said, and all of you have heard him say, you can't die until you have your replacement on board. And I think he has done a nice job in Hadco, making it an easy transition in our company. And I think the classic comment was, today my wife couldn't be here, but when I was a little late leaving, and she said, you better get going, you know John, he's always on time. So I made it on time today, John. John had a real compassionate side, even though he didn't show it very easy. But I was very close to him in Ireland, and there was a tradition in DEC in those years to give turkeys to the employees at Christmas. And that was followed on when we started up Wang over in Ireland. But we always ended up, those of you know John was very well planned. He planned everything. He calculated everything. And it is amazing how every year at Christmas we had a lot more turkeys than the employees. This is a true story. We had a lot more turkeys than employees, and every year the poor people of Galway benefited from the turkeys. Now, John wasn't as compassionate and as kind to the animals of the poor people. They had some stray animals who occasionally strayed onto the lush grass of his beloved soccer pitch, which he invested in heavily when he went to digital in Galway. And he actually participated, he was a team playing member of the factory soccer team with all the athletes there. And he had a few unfortunate incidents, slipping on the remains of some cow slips. And one evening he got some of us together, and we rented a cattle truck, and we rounded the horses and the cattle onto the truck with some difficulty, but he led us and he planned it, and those cattle were driven to another parish. That was the end of our disturbance from the cattle. He was a very compassionate person, and I know that when Nancy, or Nan as John would call her, was leading the fundraising for the Salerno nuns for the building of a new school, I know she had John's support. Quietly, he wouldn't go around knocking on doors looking for money, but he sent Nancy instead. And every time I pass that building now, I think of the Kroppers. He was an honest man of the highest integrity. You all know he shied away from and was very, very uncomfortable with off-colour remarks, off-colour comments, and he was never around, or we never even attempted any of that stuff within John's hearing. We were never quite sure of what religion John was. He had a propensity to surround them with Roman Catholics. He didn't call us RCs, but he called us fish eaters. And, you know, he always had a large collection of fish eaters on his team. I think Joe Kay last week put his finger on it. He really was of the Church of Savignon, given his appetite for a nice glass of Cabernet in the evening. We know he will be missed dearly by all of us, particularly by Nancy, Jean, Steve, and Thelma. Our prayers are with you, our sincere sympathies. I'll finish by giving a quotation that I heard him say many, many times as he moved through his career from company to company, from job to job within those companies. And he often said, "Don't worry, our paths will cross again someday." I hope so, John. Thank you very much.
Harvey Cohen.
John Kropper was my friend. I first met John back in Canada when I was working for DAC some 16 years ago. I know I don't look that old. He was a guy coming in from Ireland, and for all I knew he was Irish because I had never met him before, and I had met Pat. No, I guess I hadn't. Yeah, I had met Pat. He was working in Westminster. John had the whole staff gather around a table, and he brought a Polaroid and took all of our pictures, made us write our names on it. And at that point, right away, I said, this guy is different. At that time, I was contemplating a different work assignment I'd been in Canada for a couple of years. So there was something opening up in Ireland, and I asked John on his thoughts because I knew he was coming from Ireland. It seemed to make sense to ask a guy what it's like to live there. But he thought that was great. He, come to find out after the fact, thought it was international experience was the best thing a person could do. I really didn't get to know John at that point. I did, in fact, go to Ireland, and I was, Pat's story reminded me of the Aran Islands. Some of these are going to go way back. That was definitely a fun time. John left DEC while I was in Ireland. Actually, after a visit to Galway, as I recall, he was kind of nervous, I thought, waiting for a telegram from Wang for his Wang assignment. And I think he did get that in Germany, Pat? Is that right? Yeah, so he was pretty happy with that. And I didn't really get to see John again for, I think it was a couple of years. Dennis Shepard, who's here, somehow had gotten my name to call for an opportunity at Wang. So I went to Wang, and I went for an interview, and I talked with a whole bunch of different folks. And they said, let's do lunch. So I was walking with Rich Schulman and Dennis Shepard to the cafeteria, came around a corner, and there was John, who I hadn't seen yet. John had one of those 10-gallon spray cans, with which he proceeded to spray me, and I'll just describe it, in the area of the zipper on my pants. He was, of course, testing me to see my reaction, as he was always challenging. There's that word again. Over the years, I learned to roll with John, taking him as he taught us to take him. He was a fun-loving, serious manager that was goal-orientated in driving. I think that's the theme you're going to hear over and over. I looked at him as a strategist and an exceptional planner. As he always set out to achieve an end, he would steer the course to get there, even if it was years away. In the last 10 years, John and I got to be very good friends as the PC came along, and John needed somebody to challenge him to learn more about the PC, and we started a little mini competition, as it turns out, to learn all the different kinds of software that would make us better. He, of course, spent hours and hours and hours and hours at it, and that was not my primary thing. He, of course, needed to spend hours and hours and hours at it, and he always reminded me of that and challenged me to spend hours and hours and hours at it. But we, in fact, did do quite well. He did surpass me in some ways, but I was able to supplement some of his learning with some of the smaller things, the things that he would overlook. I always considered that I looked for the simple things, the easy way, shortcuts, etc., which I was able to teach him. And we sent email, those of you who know email, electronic mail, on a daily basis so we could keep in touch wherever he was. If it was Japan, Australia, Europe, even California and Cambridge. He did not, unfortunately, figure out how to use the system in Lithuania yet, but he was working on that. In summary, I wrote a little poem, if I can get through it. Bear with me. Oh, John, why did you go? There are no answers, we'll never know. You did so much to help us grow. Oh, John, why did you go? Your life was so fulfilled, yet so much to do. We have to go on with the memories of you. You encouraged us to learn, to follow, to achieve. Now we are only left to grieve. But we must remember what you taught, that we can only leave when our replacements are in place. Yet we have comfort knowing you're happy in another place. We feel strange that you left us so quick. We will always remember it. You taught us never quit. As far as me, I'm at a loss. You were a large part of my life that I feel is lost. No emails to comfort me in my time of grief. No emails to tell me, get back on your feet. On living your life, you made a huge impact on what we are today. For that, we are thankful and will remember you always. Thank you, John. We will miss you.
Steve? Good job, Javi. I
appreciate you all coming, especially because in my dad's efforts to look like a respectable father, I never got to hear a lot of these stories. As my friends would know, apparently the trait is genetic, but now I know I can blame it on him. My dad didn't give in easily, and he had that obstinance that came from being right about a bunch of things. So when I heard on Monday morning when they called me and told me he died skiing, I imagined that he got to the top of the ski resort and death was there waiting for him. And death said, "John, it's time." And he said, "It's not in my book." And death said, "Sorry, this is my book." And he said, "Look," my father said, "Look, I'll make a deal with you. I'll race you to the bottom. If I get there first, I get 20 more years. And if you get there first, you can take me." And I imagined death saying, "Well, I'll give you 10 years. And knowing my dad, he probably only expected 10 years, but figured he better ask for 20. So I'm sort of tickled that he died wearing his boots and his skis. About 6 years ago, I think we both got tired of sort of the chasm of adolescence, and we proceeded to spend the next 2 years learning how to hug each other. It took 2 years for us to learn that. We started shaking hands, and then we got tired of that. It was hard at first, because my dad, he's built sort of like a redwood tree, and I try to reach around him, and it didn't work real well. But we learned how to hug, and I feel real lucky. When my dad died, he was exercising daily. He would walk across town to my office. He and I would go kayaking. He was eating sort of like a new age yuppie, and we had a lot of fun. I remember we were rafting in Texas once, and I looked over at my dad, who, he's 6 foot something, 250 pounds. He's a powerful guy. And I remember being awake just a little longer than him. We were sleeping next to the river, and he was in his old army sleeping bag. And I looked over, and it was probably the first time in my life I remember looking at my dad lying somewhere peacefully, not in motion. We put some things into his coffin, and I went over to Eastern Mountain Sports, the backpacking store, because he always thought of himself as a Boy Scout, even if he was not of Boy Scout age. And I got him a compass. We put that in the coffin. I got him some rope. And then I went over to get him a flashlight. It's kind of interesting to hear a story about that flashlight. Well, I was buying him the flashlight, and I looked at it, and I realized it only had one battery, or one bulb in it. And as I was about to buy it, I thought, Dad would just curse me if he dropped it, and there was no spare bulb. So we gave him this flashlight with an extra bulb. I don't know if you knew, there were really only 2 things that scared my dad. One was heights, and the other one you might not know, but when he would walk down city streets at night, like if we were going to the theater, when we would walk down city streets at night, he was scared that he would be held up or scared that somebody would hurt him. And probably to the rest of us who thought of him as a big bear, it was hard to imagine that this guy would worry about somebody rolling him. But I wanted to let you know there were 2 things that I knew he was scared of. He was a pretty tough guy, and he really loved his work community. You were a very important side to him. We really want to hear your stories because, as I said, as my father, he always worked hard to look respectable, but we knew that there were some stories behind him. So if you're too solemn, we'll know you're not telling the whole story. Last thing is, I found a quote last week that I think typifies him. The quote said, "Sometimes the fool who rushes in gets the job done." So thank you for coming.
I don't know, Steve, for some of us, looking respectable, that's kind of stretching a little bit. Take a look at these pictures. Come on. Joe Maffione, you want to come up?
I had the good fortune to work closely with John during the last few years. He was a thinker and a doer. He was a natural leader. He could be impatient, but he could also be patient. He appeared tough, but he could also be sensitive. He was my friend. John's impatience was something to behold. A year ago, we went to California for a meeting with some investors scheduled for a Monday. We went early in order to let our bodies adjust to the time change. John thought 3 days would be about right, one for each hour of change. It just so happened that we had tickets to the auto race at Laguna Seca on Saturday. Laguna Seca is a beautiful place, the top of a mountain, but access is very limited. There's only one road in or out, and it was a very popular event. Many thousands of people were there. We had a good time at the race. I seem to remember something about Cabernet Sauvignon. But when we left, there was an enormous traffic jam. John, being John, decided he'd help. He walked halfway down the mountain and began directing traffic. I was instructed to drive the rental car and let no one in front of me, no one. Many lanes converged into few, and John, while he tried very hard to be impartial, somehow favored the lane I was in by the order of 10 to 1. Officials noticed the uneven flow and asked what he was doing. He innocently responded, volunteering. They thanked him and suggested his services were no longer needed. John returned to the car with his Cheshire grin. I suggested he drive. No, he thought, why do that? If we switched seats, someone was likely to slip in front of us. Why would you risk that? Kropper's stopwatch was running. So John sat in the passenger seat and coached me. At one point, we connected with the car in front of us in an effort to keep an interloper from squeezing in. Later, a young woman came and banged on all our windows and yelled something at the top of her lungs we couldn't quite make out as she expressed her displeasure with our approach to the situation. John's grin just got wider. John had a saying, it is better to go 5 miles an hour in the right direction than 100 miles an hour in the wrong direction. At Laguna Seca on that day, he wanted to go just a little bit faster. But John could be patient. If you showed him you wanted to learn and would listen, he was a willing and patient mentor. His impatience centered on trivial things, especially time wasted, measured in fractions of a second. When it came to people, he understood an individual's ability. If he thought you were doing your best, he'd work with you. I learned a lot from John and was fortunate to have been able to spend so much time with him. John was a thinker. In the last couple of years, John and I spent a fair bit of time side by side in airplane seats and rental cars. We'd even have an occasional glass of wine after hours. I enjoyed many hours of stimulating conversation with him on any number of topics. One common thread joins all these conversations. John appeared to have thought through everything in advance. I cannot remember an instance where he had not worked his way through a topic in detail. As most of us know, the quality of his thinking was typically excellent. But John was no armchair philosopher. He was a doer and a confident leader. At no time that I knew him did John betray lack of confidence or show self-doubt. Confidence begets confidence. People believed John would get them past the difficulties of the moment. He thought through a situation, then he took action. He was decisive. He had the confidence to change course when it was called for. Another Kropperism, if you continue to do the things the same way, you will continue to get the same results. His careful advanced planning did not cause him to lose his ability to analyze a situation and make corrections. He could change course without losing control. If someone had a better suggestion, he'd go with it. John was ethical. He would say, I'll run into people again and again. I want to be able to look everyone in the eye 30 years from now. He avoided even the appearance of impropriety. Most people saw John as tough. Those that did not know him well saw only the tough side of him. Some of this he fostered. When he tried to be a curmudgeon, he could teach W.C. Fields a thing or two about small children. In his words, one should have a healthy lack of sympathy for the other guy's problems. His physical size contributed to the impression, as did his ability to maintain a good poker face. But his toughness was, in large part, the product of having thought through a situation and having the confidence to execute a plan without flinching. Emotion wasn't logical, so control it. But he could be sensitive. I know John could be sensitive. Yet I'm not sure he'd want anyone telling the whole world what a big old sensitive guy he was. Cheers, John.
Lou? Thanks, Joe. Well done.
He did help make us better, didn't he? He really made a difference in a lot of lives, as you've heard. When I first came from Florida up to Massachusetts to work for John, that was the reason I came to Massachusetts, because after I met him, I wanted to make sure that I worked for him, because I couldn't quite believe him. I couldn't believe there was somebody like him. So I drove up here, and the first weekend, he asked me to come up to Waterville Valley. I'm not sure quite why at the time, but I thought at least I'm going to get an insight to the gentleman. And a gentleman he was. I was there, I believe, Friday around 4 o'clock. I got through helping pile a couple cords of wood. I don't know quite how he did it. At that time, since then I have figured it out, he had me up on top of the house cleaning the chimney. Is this why he brought me from Florida? And then we spent a considerable amount of time just talking philosophy, just how business should be done. I certainly learned more from John than anybody that I have come in contact with. And the joy that I've had in sharing what he taught me with others has been significant. And it goes on, not just at work, but home. He was truly a person that did help make us better. And when you think about influence, I read something and it kind of made me think of John. I could tell where the lamplighter was by the trail he left behind him. It's a hell of a trail.
Lou left a little bit out of the story. About 5 days after he joined the company, one day at around 10 o'clock coffee break time, there was a big commotion up in Tewksbury Building 2, and it was John and Lou wrestling in the hallway, and people were just scattering to get out of the way. See, so. Anybody else want to come up and share publicly a Kropper story or a Kropperism? Thelma. This should be good, yes. John's sister Thelma.
I hadn't really planned on saying anything, but when I see the sign, "He helped to make us better," that certainly speaks very much to me. When you're a little kid, you don't always want to listen to your parents. Whatever they say, you want to do the opposite. But I was fortunate in having John for a big brother, and he really gave me the right advice in so many different ways. Every major decision of my life along the way, whenever I didn't know quite what I wanted to do, he put his finger on what I ought to do, and without saying very much, but you just knew what was the right thing to do. I can remember when we were little, he had a paper route, and he was getting all kinds of money from this, and I didn't have any money, and he was buying himself all these things, and I wanted to buy things. So he said, "Well, I'll give you 50 of my customers." Of course, he gave me the 50 furthest away. Yeah. And then when I got my money, I was all set to go and buy something. And he sat me down and he said, "Now you figure out the interest that $1 is going to make, compound it once a month for 20 years. So I did it, and he corrected me if I made an error along the way, and finally saw what a fantastic sum it was, and he said, "Now, do you really want to buy that, or are you going to save your money?" Well, of course, I couldn't buy a thing. My whole life, I think, until at least 10 years after I was married, I couldn't go out and buy a cup of coffee. I could hear John saying, "Don't waste that nickel." There were so many things like that. He was just a fantastic brother, bossy, domineering. We were terribly competitive in so many ways, but it was always a good, positive spirit, and I just can't quite believe that he's not here to fall back on for whatever might come along, and maybe he really is here. But so many people have said to me in the last couple of weeks, it's a shame he had to die so young. It's a shame he's gone so soon. And I truly believe that he lived 25 or 28 hours every day. I think he really got more into life than so many of us. And so he did just what he said he wanted to do. He said he was going to die of a heart attack doing what he loved, and I hope I can do the same. Thanks, all of you, for being here.
He probably wanted you to save that money so he could hit you up for a loan later. Low interest. Anyone else? If not, if you haven't seen the pictures we have down... Oop. Joe Kay.
The Sheridan remark that Mike talked about, I think I want to do is tell you about that, because there's a lot more to it than Mike went over with. But one of the things is, as I was sitting out here, John certainly wouldn't want us to be solemn. I think he would really start busting us very hard. It would be water pistols or whatever. But at the same time, I think he would appreciate us appreciating him. He had that part in him that he wanted to know that you did appreciate him. And I think also the part that I think he's thinking about is how John would just laugh about the old stories. As you know, he's a big guy, and he would have that hearty, big, smiling laugh of his that just kind of warmed you up, and you had a nice time with it. And he did very well with it, Pat. You know how we feel. The first time we met anyone was one of the stories we were talking about. And of course, the first time I met John, I can still remember Dooley, Pillen, Mike, you were there, we were in Nashua, and we met him, and this huge hulk of a guy came in, and we were absolutely positive he was a Marine. In fact, there was a drill instructor in the Marine when he first came in, and we were very intimidated by the fellow. But actually, very quickly, we found out that he was special. There was an awful lot of depth in him, and also he had that fun from day one. He brought that out, and we were, I think, looking forward to him, but at the same time, just looking at all the fun that he would bring. And it was a very, very good time. One of the things, I think, two stories I'll tell you is, when he first came into the company, the toughest part we were struggling with was R&D. Harry, you remember the R&D meetings that Dr. Wang was sat here, Don Dunning, you were over there, some of the managers, of course, Horace Sang was there, and many of the R&D managers. And John would sit there, and one of the pictures kind of depicts, he was this huge hulk at the table, and his head was down, and many of you remember he would doodle all the time. And one of the pictures he would make was a picture of him with a couple of stray hairs going on, this big picture and a big smile on him. And he always had that as a part of his trademark. And as we were sitting in the R&D meetings, this is an R&D meeting with, of course, Wang was so big and it was so important that we drove products, everyone was very intense at these meetings, including Dr. Wang. John, he would be hulked over and he would be sitting and doodling across there, right? And in very intense part of the meetings, he would pass you a note across this big conference room table. And of course, you kind of just pull it over, slide it over, and you say, oh boy, here's the answer. You'd look at it and you say, you dumbass, why didn't you ship this, right, with this pen? Oh, God. Right? You try to slither under the table. That was John, and that's what he did. And at the same time, you weren't upset with it, and that was just a fact of life, and that's what he pushed you on. As many of you said, he stretched us and stretched us very hard. The other story is the one of the infamous Sheridan. So I just want to tell you a little bit about that story. It was in the Sheridan in Boxborough, and we had an off-site, and the conference rooms were set up where there were sliding glass doors on one side, and then there was large tables around, and there was another door on the other side. At this meeting, there was all of us manufacturing folks. One of the persons there was Florence Yen, and when we were in there sitting and talking, we found out later the deck guys were next door in the next conference room. And the deck guys, of course, knew a hell of a lot more about John than we ever thought. So immediately, they started locking the doors, closing up, and battening down the hatches. And we went through our meetings, and John was saying, geez, we got to get these deck guys. You know, these were guys I worked with, but that's the old days, and now we're with Wang, and we ought to get these guys. So we're talking about it, and what we decided to do is at lunchtime we went off and bought balloons, and we filled them up with water. So we were loaded up with water balloons. And right after lunch, we had a few of the guys that was in the Sheridan. There was trees, boulders, and whatnot, and all the guys were strategically placed on one side. And I remember there was John, myself, and a couple others, and Florence Yen were going to come in through the door. So, of course, the deck guys are never going to open it up to ugly guys like us. So we got Florence, and little Florence, a little Chinese lady, tapped on the door very quietly. And the guy opened it up with a big chain across, and he's looking through, and he says, Jesus, little Chinese lady here, you know? I said, what does she want? She said, I don't know. She wants to come in and talk to us. I said, all right, must be all right. So they opened the door, and by that time, John pushed us all through, right? And we all started throwing the water balloons. And, of course, everyone headed out through the sliding glass doors where the Wang ambush was waiting. They just killed them. They were just smashing. But the funniest part was we were throwing the balloons, and John heaved the balloon at this one guy who was kind of stranded in the corner. And the balloon hit him full across the chest. It just kind of like spread out, but it didn't break, right? And this guy looked at it and says, John, I got you, right? He took that balloon, just heaved it back, and John, of course, just stepped aside. And there was Florence. Just unbelievable. To this day, I still get a laugh to the day that we look back many, many years back. We can still look at all those fun things that we had. But in closing, the hardest thing is I think about John in many ways, and the thing that comes to my mind the most is I can never, ever remember having a dull conversation with the guy. It was motivating, sometimes intimidating. It was always funny, not always funny. Many times it was funny, but it never, ever, ever, ever was dull. It always had substance. It was never superficial, and it was just awfully fun with John. Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, I think that what I take away certainly is, he taught a lot of us to not do things right, but do the right thing. So I think that's what Lou tried to say, and what everybody's trying to say. He made us think, and we had a good time with him. So feel free to come and see the pictures if you haven't. The family is here. If you don't want to tell it publicly, tell them in private. Sign the books, and for the family, I thank you all for coming.